They never told you the full story of World War I. While millions died in the trenches of Europe, there were entire armies fighting wars you've never even heard about. And what happened there changed everything. World War I. When you hear those words, you probably think of muddy trenches, barbed wire, and soldiers stuck in France and Belgium. That's what the history books show us. That's what the movies focus on. But here's the thing. While Europe was tearing itself apart, there were massive battles happening in places most people don't even know existed during the war. We're talking about jungles in Africa, deserts in the Middle East, and isolated islands in the Pacific. These weren't small skirmishes. These were full-scale military campaigns involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the consequences of these forgotten fronts still affect our world today. The problem is simple. History forgot about these places. When we learn about World War I, we get tunnel vision, we focus on the Western Front, maybe touch on the Eastern Front if we're lucky, and then we move on. But this creates a massive blind spot in our understanding of the war. We miss out on incredible stories of survival, strategy, and sacrifice. We don't understand why the modern Middle East looks the way it does. We don't know why Africa's borders are drawn so strangely, and we have no idea that World War I even reached the Pacific Ocean. These forgotten fronts weren't side stories. They were crucial parts of the war that shaped the entire 20th century. So, let's fix that blind spot right now. Let's start with Africa. Now, in 1914, Africa wasn't filled with independent nations like it is today. Most of the continent was carved up between European powers. Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, they all had colonies there. And so did Germany. When war broke out in Europe, it immediately spread to Africa. Colonial powers wanted to seize their enemies' territories. It was strategic, it was about resources, and it was about pride. The African campaigns were brutal in ways that Europe never experienced. Forget trenches and artillery. In Africa, soldiers faced malaria, dysentery, sleeping sickness, and tropical diseases that killed more men than bullets ever did. There were no supply lines like in Europe. Armies had to carry everything with them or take it from local populations. And the terrain was unforgiving. Thick jungles, massive deserts, mountains, and rivers that could swallow entire units. The East African campaign is where things got really intense. German East Africa, which is basically modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, became the site of one of the longest campaigns of the entire war. And it all centered around one man, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. This German commander became a legend. He had a small force, maybe 14,000 men at the start, and most of them were African Askari, soldiers, not Europeans. He was massively outnumbered. The British threw over 300,000 troops at him over the course of the war. 300,000 against 14,000. And yet, Lettow-Vorbeck never lost. Here's how he did it: guerrilla warfare. He refused to fight conventional battles. Instead, he would hit supply lines, ambush columns, destroy railways, and then disappear into the bush before the British could respond. He kept moving constantly. His troops marched thousands of miles through jungle and savanna, living off the land, capturing British supplies and staying just out of reach. The British were always one step behind. They brought in troops from India, South Africa, Rhodesia, and West Africa. They tried everything. Large offensives, small mobile columns, even using aircraft for reconnaissance. Nothing worked. The conditions were insane. Soldiers on both sides dealt with tsetse flies that cause sleeping sickness. Men would suddenly become drowsy, fall into comas, and die. Malaria was everywhere. Some units had 70% of their men sick at any given time. Wounds that would heal easily in Europe became infected in the tropical heat and killed soldiers within days. Water was scarce in some regions and contaminated in others. Food supplies rotted in the humidity, and all of this happened while men were shooting at each other. Lettow-Vorbeck's strategy was genius in its simplicity. He understood that he couldn't win a conventional war, so he didn't try. His goal was to tie down as many Allied troops as possible and keep them away from the main theaters in Europe. Every British soldier chasing him through the African bush was one less soldier on the Western Front. Every ship bringing supplies to East Africa was one less ship supporting operations elsewhere. He turned his weakness into strength by making the vast African landscape his ally. The British tried everything to catch him. They sent in experienced commanders from other fronts. They used local scouts who knew the terrain. They built new railway lines to improve supply routes. They even tried to use the geography against him by pushing him into areas where they thought he'd be trapped. But Lettow-Vorbeck was always thinking 3 steps ahead. When the British thought they had him cornered against a river, he'd already built rafts and crossed it. When they thought he'd run out of ammunition, his men had captured a British supply depot. When disease hit his forces hard, he'd retreat to healthier regions and recruit more Askari soldiers. The Askari soldiers deserve special mention here. These were African men recruited or conscripted into the German colonial army. Many of them were incredibly loyal to Leto Vorbeck, not because they loved Germany, but because he treated them better than most colonial officers treated their troops. He ate the same food, endured the same hardships, and showed them respect. In return, they fought with discipline and courage that impressed even their enemies. Some Askari units would charge British positions with such determination that British officers wrote about them in their reports with a mixture of fear and admiration. But here's what makes this campaign really significant. It tied up huge numbers of Allied troops and resources that could have been used in Europe. Britain had to ship soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and supplies halfway around the world just to chase one German commander through the jungle. Those resources could have changed the balance on the Western Front. Ships that could have been transporting American troops in 1917 were instead hauling supplies to East Africa. Artillery that could have supported offensives in France was being dragged through African swamps. Medical personnel who could have saved lives in European field hospitals were treating malaria cases in makeshift clinics under canvas tents in the middle of nowhere. Leto Vorbeck's guerrilla campaign lasted the entire war. He only surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice was signed in Europe, and even then, he was undefeated in the field. He surrendered because Germany had lost the war in Europe, not because he had been beaten in Africa. When he finally did surrender on November 25, 1918, he still had about 1,300 men under his command, and they were still capable of fighting. The British officers who accepted his surrender treated him with enormous respect. In military circles, he was considered one of the most effective guerrilla commanders in modern history. And the African soldiers in this campaign? They're almost never mentioned. Hundreds of thousands of Africans fought in World War I, both as soldiers and as porters carrying supplies. The Carrier Corps in East Africa alone numbered over 1 million men. These weren't volunteers. They were forced into service by colonial powers. Colonial authorities would enter villages and simply take men of fighting age. Families were torn apart. Entire communities lost their workforce. And these men were expected to carry heavy loads through impossible terrain while being paid almost nothing and given minimal food. The death rate among carriers was horrific. Some estimates suggest that over 100,000 African carriers died during the East African campaign alone. They died from disease, exhaustion, starvation, and violence. They drowned crossing rivers, and they were killed in ambushes meant for the soldiers they were supporting. They collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind to die because the columns couldn't wait for them. Their stories are almost completely absent from World War I history, but without them, none of these campaigns could have happened. Every bullet, every shell, every piece of equipment, every scrap of food, it all had to be carried on someone's back through hundreds of miles of African wilderness. The African campaigns also included fighting in Cameroon, Togoland, and Southwest Africa. German colonies fell one by one, but the fighting was always difficult. In Cameroon, Allied forces struggled through rainforest so thick that they had to cut paths with machetes. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day, not kilometers. The humidity was so intense that metal rusted overnight and leather rotted within weeks. Soldiers developed fungal infections on their feet that made walking agony. The Germans and their local forces used the terrain expertly, setting up ambushes in the dense vegetation where visibility was measured in meters. The campaign in Cameroon involved British, French, and Belgian forces attacking from multiple directions. It took them over a year to finally push the German forces to the Spanish border, where they crossed into neutral territory and were interned. But that year of fighting through rainforest cost thousands of lives, most of them from disease rather than combat. Entire units were rendered combat ineffective, not from casualties but from sickness. Officers would report having only 20 or 30 men fit for duty out of companies that should have numbered over 100. In Togoland, which was a small German colony in West Africa, the campaign was shorter but no less difficult. Allied forces invaded from the British Gold Coast and French Dahomey. The Germans had built a powerful radio station at Kamina that could communicate with Berlin, and the Allies wanted to capture or destroy it. The Germans, knowing they couldn't hold the colony, fought a delaying action and then destroyed the radio station themselves before surrendering. The campaign lasted only a few weeks, but it showed how even small colonial territories became strategic targets in the global conflict. Southwest Africa, which is modern Namibia, saw a different kind of campaign. This was desert warfare at its most extreme. The terrain was vast, open, and brutally hot. Water sources were rare and often poisoned by retreating German forces. The Union of South Africa, which was a British dominion, provided most of the troops for this campaign. But there was a problem. Many Afrikaners in South Africa were sympathetic to Germany and opposed fighting for Britain. This led to a rebellion that had to be put down before the campaign against German Southwest Africa could even begin. Once the internal rebellion was crushed, South African forces invaded German Southwest Africa from multiple directions. The Germans fought a defensive campaign, retreating inland and forcing the South Africans to extend their supply lines across the desert. But the South Africans had superior numbers and eventually surrounded the German forces, forcing their surrender in July 1915. The campaign was relatively quick, but it still cost lives and resources, and it showed how World War I affected even the most remote corners of the planet, and here's the lasting impact. When Germany lost the war, they lost all their African colonies. Britain and France divided up German territories between themselves. They drew new borders, created new administrative regions, and set up systems of control that ignored ethnic groups, traditional territories, and local politics. The borders they drew often split ethnic groups in half or forced traditional enemies to live in the same colony. These decisions were made in Europe by men who had never set foot in Africa and didn't care about the consequences. Those borders still exist today. When African countries gained independence in the mid-20th century, they largely kept the colonial borders because changing them would have been even more chaotic. But those artificial borders created by European powers in 1919 and 1920 are a major reason for many conflicts in modern Africa. Civil wars, ethnic tensions, resource conflicts, many of these can be traced directly back to the borders drawn after World War I. The Forgotten African Front had consequences that lasted generations and continue to this day. Now let's move to the Middle East, because this is where World War I literally created the modern world we live in. In 1914, the Middle East was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. This was a massive empire that had existed for centuries, stretching from Turkey through Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and down into Arabia. The Ottoman Empire was old, weakened, and struggling to modernize, but it still controlled vast territories and millions of people. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war on Germany's side in October 1914, Britain immediately saw an opportunity and a threat. The threat was the Suez Canal. This canal in Egypt was Britain's lifeline to India and the rest of their empire in Asia. British ships carrying troops, supplies, and resources had to pass through the Suez Canal to reach India. If the Ottomans captured it, Britain's ability to move troops and supplies would be crippled. The entire British Empire in Asia would be vulnerable. So Britain had to defend Egypt and the canal at all costs. The opportunity was to finally dismantle the Ottoman Empire and take control of its territories. Britain wanted the oil fields in Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq. Oil was becoming increasingly important for modern warfare. Ships were switching from coal to oil. Trucks and cars needed gasoline. The new tanks being developed ran on petroleum products. Whoever controlled oil would have a massive advantage in future conflicts. Britain also wanted control over Palestine and the route to India, and they saw a chance to redraw the entire map of the Middle East in their favor. The first major campaign was in Mesopotamia. British and Indian troops invaded from the Persian Gulf in November 1914, moving up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers toward Baghdad. At first, things went well. They captured Basra easily. The Ottoman forces in southern Mesopotamia were weak and disorganized. British commanders were confident and started pushing north. But then everything went wrong. In 1915, a British force under General Charles Townshend pushed too far forward and got surrounded at a town called Kut al-Amara. The Ottomans besieged them. For 5 months, British and Indian soldiers were trapped with dwindling supplies. They ate their horses, and they ate their mules. They rationed water to tiny amounts per man per day. Disease spread through the crowded town. Men died from starvation, dysentery, and wounds that couldn't be properly treated. The British tried multiple times to break through and relieve the siege, but every attempt failed with heavy casualties. When they finally surrendered on April 29, 1916, it was one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. 13,000 men became prisoners of war. The Ottomans marched them north toward prison camps in Anatolia. The conditions on this march were terrible. Men died every day from exhaustion, disease, and mistreatment. Some estimates suggest that nearly 70% of the British and Indian prisoners died in captivity. The Turkish guards were harsh, food was scarce, and medical care was non-existent. Men who had survived the siege died within weeks of surrendering. The fall of Kut was a disaster for British prestige. In London, politicians were furious. The public was shocked. How could a British army surrender to what many Westerners considered an inferior enemy? The defeat showed that the Ottoman Empire, despite its problems, was still capable of fighting effectively. It also showed that the campaigns outside Europe were not going to be easy victories. But Britain didn't give up. They reorganized, brought in more troops, improved their supply lines, and tried again. A new commander, General Stanley Maude, took over. He was more cautious and methodical than his predecessors. He built up supplies, improved logistics, and trained his troops better. In 1917, he launched a new offensive. This time, things went differently. British forces pushed steadily north, defeating Ottoman armies in a series of battles. On March 11, 1917, they finally captured Baghdad. This was a huge symbolic victory and gave Britain control over Mesopotamia's oil resources. The capture of Baghdad was celebrated in Britain and across the Allied world. It was a major victory at a time when the war in Europe seemed endless. British propaganda made the most of it, portraying it as a triumph of civilization over barbarism. But for the people of Mesopotamia, it was just one foreign occupier replacing another. The British would control Iraq for decades, drawing borders and installing rulers that suited their interests, not the interests of the Iraqi people. The British continued pushing north through Mesopotamia, capturing more territory and oil fields. By the end of the war, they controlled the entire region. This gave them access to some of the richest oil deposits in the world, which would prove crucial in the 20th century as oil became the most important resource for industrial economies and military power. Then there's the campaign in Palestine and Syria. This is where stories like Lawrence of Arabia come from, but the reality was way more complex than the movie shows. Britain supported an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. The Arabs had their own reasons for rebelling. They wanted independence and self-rule. The Ottoman Empire had been their rulers for centuries, and many Arabs, especially in the Hejaz region of Arabia, wanted to break free. Britain saw the Arab revolt as a way to weaken the Ottomans from within. They sent officers to advise the Arab forces. The most famous was T.E. Lawrence, a British archaeologist turned military advisor. But Lawrence wasn't leading the Arab revolt. He was advising it. The real leaders were Arab figures like Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, and his sons, especially Faisal. These men had their own goals and strategies. They weren't just following British orders. Arab forces, led by figures like Faisal and advised by British officers like Lawrence, launched guerrilla attacks on Ottoman supply lines, especially the Hejaz Railway. This railway was crucial for the Ottoman Empire. It connected Damascus to Medina and allowed them to move troops and supplies quickly through Arabia. If the railway was cut, Ottoman forces in Arabia would be isolated and vulnerable. The Arab forces excelled at guerrilla warfare. They would ride out of the desert on camels, blow up sections of the railway, attack Ottoman garrisons, and then disappear back into the desert before reinforcements could arrive. The Ottomans couldn't catch them. The desert was too vast, and the Arabs knew the terrain perfectly. They knew where every water source was, where they could hide, and how to survive in conditions that would kill Ottoman soldiers from cities like Istanbul or Damascus. The railway raids were incredibly effective. The Ottomans had to station thousands of troops along the railway to guard it, troops that could have been used elsewhere. They had to constantly repair damaged sections of track. They had to send supply convoys under heavy guard, which slowed everything down. The Arab revolt tied down Ottoman resources just as effectively as Leto Vorbeck's campaign in Africa tied down British resources. Meanwhile, British forces invaded Palestine from Egypt. The early attempts failed. Gaza was heavily defended, and British attacks in early 1917 were beaten back with heavy casualties. The Ottomans had built strong defensive positions, and the British tactics weren't working. Artillery bombardments would tear up the defenses, but Ottoman soldiers would survive in dugouts and bunkers and then emerge to fight when British infantry attacked. It was like the Western Front, but in the desert. But under a new commander, General Edmund Allenby, the British changed tactics. Allenby was a smart and flexible commander. He used mobility, deception, and coordination with Arab forces to outmaneuver the Ottomans. Instead of attacking Gaza head-on again, he used a feint to make the Ottomans think he was going to attack Gaza, but then he attacked Beersheba on the inland flank. The attack on Beersheba included a famous cavalry charge by Australian light horsemen who captured the town and its crucial water wells in one of the last great cavalry charges in military history. With Beersheba captured, Allenby could outflank Gaza. The Ottoman defenses that had held for months suddenly became useless. They had to retreat or be surrounded. British forces pushed north through Palestine. In December 1917, Allenby captured Jerusalem. This was a massive propaganda victory for the Allies. A Christian army taking the holy city from Muslim control had huge symbolic weight. Allenby famously entered Jerusalem on foot out of respect for the city's religious significance, a gesture that was photographed and celebrated across the Christian world. But the fighting didn't stop with Jerusalem. The British continued north through Palestine and into Syria. The battles were fought in deserts, hills, and occasional oases. Water was always a critical factor. Entire operations were planned around where armies could find water sources. You couldn't just march an army anywhere you wanted. You had to march where there was water. This meant that both sides could predict where the other would move, but it also meant that controlling water sources was crucial. If you controlled the wells and springs, you controlled the campaign. Troops suffered from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and desert diseases. The temperatures in summer could reach 50 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there wasn't much shade. Men would collapse from heat stroke. Water rations were carefully controlled because there was never enough. Soldiers would become so thirsty that they'd drink contaminated water, leading to dysentery and other waterborne diseases that could kill just as surely as bullets. The Ottoman forces were also struggling. By 1918, they were running out of everything: ammunition, food, replacement troops, medical supplies. Their soldiers were exhausted and demoralized. Many Ottoman units were filled with Arab conscripts who had no desire to fight for the Ottoman Empire and would desert at the first opportunity. The backbone of the Ottoman army was Turkish soldiers from Anatolia, but even they were tired after years of war on multiple fronts. In September 1918, Allenby launched his final offensive, known as the Battle of Megiddo. It was a masterpiece of military planning. British forces broke through Ottoman lines in multiple places, using speed and surprise. Cavalry and infantry poured through the gaps, cutting off Ottoman retreat routes. The Ottoman armies in Palestine and Syria collapsed. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers surrendered. The rest fled north in complete disorder. Arab and British forces captured Damascus on October 1, 1918. For the Arabs, this was the culmination of their revolt. Damascus was one of the great cities of the Arab world, and its capture symbolized the end of Ottoman rule. There were celebrations in the streets. Arab flags flew over the city. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Arabs would get the independence they had fought for. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice on October 30, 1918. After over 400 years, Ottoman control over the Arab world was finished. The empire that had once stretched from Vienna to Yemen was reduced to Anatolia, the core Turkish lands. The Middle East would never be the same. Now here's where things get really important for today's world. During the war, Britain made conflicting promises to different groups. They promised the Arabs independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. This was done through correspondence between British officials and Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca. Hussein understood these promises to mean that Arabs would control an independent kingdom stretching from Syria to Yemen. British officials were deliberately vague about the exact borders, but Hussein believed he had been promised Arab independence. At the same time, Britain promised the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. This was a statement by the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, saying that Britain supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Jewish people had faced centuries of persecution in Europe, and the Zionist movement wanted a homeland where Jews could live safely. The Balfour Declaration seemed to promise them that homeland in Palestine. And secretly, Britain and France agreed to divide up Ottoman territories between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, negotiated in 1916. This was a secret deal where British and French diplomats drew lines on a map, dividing the Middle East into zones of influence. Britain would control Mesopotamia and areas around Palestine. France would control Syria and Lebanon. These lines were drawn without any consultation with the people who actually lived there. All three of these promises couldn't be kept at the same time. You can't promise Arabs independence, promise Jews a homeland in the same territory, and secretly plan to divide it all up with France. But that's exactly what Britain did. And when the war ended, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. After the war, Britain and France carved up the Middle East into artificial states. They drew borders on maps without caring about ethnic groups, religions, or historical territories. The League of Nations gave them mandates to control these territories, which was just a fancy way of saying they got to rule them as colonies. Iraq was created by jamming together three Ottoman provinces with different populations. The north was mostly Kurdish, the center was Sunni Arab, and the south was Shiite Arab. These groups had different histories, different identities, and different interests, but Britain forced them into one country because it was administratively convenient and because it allowed Britain to control the oil fields throughout the region. They installed a king, Faisal, who had led Arab forces during the revolt. But Faisal was from the Hejaz in Arabia, not from Iraq, and many Iraqis saw him as a foreign puppet. Syria and Lebanon were created under French control. France drew a border between Syria and Lebanon, creating Lebanon as a separate state with a large Christian population. This division made little historical sense, but it served French interests. The French wanted a Christian ally in the Middle East, so they carved out Lebanon. In Syria, the French faced constant resistance and had to use military force to maintain control. Palestine became a British mandate, and this is where the most lasting conflict emerged. The British tried to balance their promises to Arabs and Jews, but it was impossible. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, especially as Jews fled persecution in Europe. The Arab population in Palestine saw this as a threat and resisted. Tensions escalated into violence. The British tried various solutions, but nothing worked. The problem they created in 1917 and 1918 would explode in 1948 and continues to this day. These decisions made in 1918 and the early 1920s created many of the borders and tensions that exist in the Middle East today. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the instability of Iraq, the creation of Syria and Lebanon, the Kurdish desire for independence, all of this traces back to World War I and the forgotten Middle Eastern Front. The people making these decisions in London and Paris had no idea they were creating problems that would last a century. Or maybe they did know and didn't care because they wouldn't be around to deal with the consequences. The Gallipoli campaign also deserves mention here, even though it happened earlier in the war. In 1915, the Allies tried to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war quickly by invading through the Dardanelles Strait and capturing Constantinople. The plan looked good on paper. If they could capture the Ottoman capital, the empire would collapse, Russia could be supplied through the Black Sea, and the war might end years earlier. But the reality was a disaster. Allied troops, including massive numbers of Australian and New Zealand soldiers from the Anzac Corps, landed on beaches on the Gallipoli Peninsula on April 25, 1915. The Ottomans were ready for them. Turkish soldiers under the command of Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, fought fiercely. The beaches were covered with barbed wire and overlooked by trenches and machine gun positions. Allied soldiers were cut down as they waded ashore. Those who made it off the beaches found themselves pinned down on narrow strips of coast, unable to advance inland. The campaign became another form of trench warfare, but on rocky cliffs overlooking the sea. The terrain was even worse than in France. Trenches were shallow because the ground was so rocky. There was no room for elaborate defensive systems. Turkish and Allied trenches were sometimes only meters apart. Men could throw grenades into enemy trenches. Snipers were a constant threat. Any movement during daylight was dangerous. The heat in summer was terrible. Water was scarce. Flies swarmed everywhere, attracted by the corpses lying in no man's land that couldn't be retrieved. Disease ravaged both sides. Dysentery was epidemic. Men would lose half their body weight from illness. The medical facilities were overwhelmed. Wounded men would lie for hours or days waiting for treatment. Some died from minor wounds that became infected in the unsanitary conditions. After months of pointless bloodshed, the Allies evacuated in December 1915 and January 1916. The evacuation was the only part of the campaign that went well. They managed to withdraw thousands of troops with minimal casualties, but the campaign had failed completely. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Ottoman casualties were similar, and nothing had been achieved. The Ottomans remained in the war. Constantinople was never threatened, and the whole campaign was a waste of lives and resources. But Gallipoli became a defining moment for countries like Australia and New Zealand. For these young nations, it was their first major military campaign. The bravery and sacrifice of the Anzac troops created a national legend. Anzac Day, April 25th, is still commemorated every year in Australia and New Zealand as their most important national day of remembrance. The campaign, despite being a military failure, shaped their national identities and their sense of themselves as independent nations, not just British colonies. For Turkey, Gallipoli was also important. It was a rare Ottoman victory in a war full of defeats. Mustafa Kemal became a national hero. His leadership at Gallipoli gave him the prestige and credibility that he would use after the war to create modern Turkey from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish defense of Gallipoli became a symbol of national resistance and pride. Now, the Pacific theater of World War I is probably the most forgotten of all. Most people have no idea World War I even reached the Pacific, but it did, and what happened there set the stage for World War II in Asia. Germany had colonies scattered across the Pacific before the war. They controlled parts of New Guinea, Samoa, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, and they had a major naval base at Tsingtao in China. These colonies seemed far from Europe, but they were strategically important. German ships operating from these bases could raid Allied shipping throughout the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The radio stations in these colonies could communicate with German ships and with Berlin. They were potential threats that the Allies couldn't ignore. When war broke out, these colonies were isolated and vulnerable. Germany couldn't send reinforcements or supplies. The German Navy couldn't protect them because British and Japanese naval power in the Pacific was too strong. The colonies were on their own, and the Allies, especially Japan, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, moved quickly to seize them. Japan's role is particularly important. Japan was allied with Britain through the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, signed in 1902. This alliance was originally meant to counter Russian expansion in East Asia, but when World War I started, it brought Japan into the war on the Allied side. Japan saw the war as an opportunity to expand its influence in Asia and the Pacific. Within months of the war, Japan captured Germany's Qingdao base in China after a short siege in November 1914. This gave Japan control over German concessions in the Shandong Peninsula of China. More importantly, Japan occupied Germany's Pacific island chains, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands. These islands seem small and insignificant. Most of them are tiny coral atolls with small populations. But they were strategically crucial. They controlled sea routes across the Pacific. Ships sailing from Asia to the Americas, or from Asia to Australia, had to pass near these islands. Whoever controlled the islands could monitor and threaten shipping. They could establish naval bases and airfields. Japan took these islands easily. There were small German garrisons, but they couldn't resist Japanese naval power. Most surrendered without much fighting. By the end of 1914, Japan controlled all of Germany's Pacific colonies north of the equator. Australia and New Zealand also grabbed German territories. Australian forces occupied German New Guinea in September 1914. This was the northeastern part of New Guinea, which Germany had controlled as a colony. An Australian naval and military expedition landed and quickly overwhelmed the small German garrison. The campaign was short and relatively bloodless, but it was important for Australia. It was their first independent military action, and it secured their northern approaches. New Zealand took Samoa in August 1914. A New Zealand expeditionary force landed and occupied the islands without resistance. Germany simply didn't have the forces there to fight back. The occupation of Samoa was quick and easy, but it had consequences. New Zealand would control Samoa for decades, and the relationship between New Zealand and Samoa remains important today. These weren't massive military campaigns like in Europe or the Middle East, but they were important. They showed how the war was truly global, and how even remote Pacific islands became pawns in the larger conflict. Every German colony, no matter how small, was seized by the Allies. Germany's overseas empire was completely dismantled. The Pacific campaigns were quick and relatively bloodless compared to other fronts, but the consequences were long-lasting. Japan's expansion in World War I emboldened them. They had successfully taken territory and increased their power in Asia with barely any resistance from other powers. The European powers were too busy fighting each other in Europe to care much about what Japan was doing in the Pacific. This set a precedent. Japan learned that they could expand aggressively, and the other powers wouldn't stop them. At the Paris Peace Conference after the war, Japan was given a mandate over the former German islands. This meant they officially controlled them under League of Nations authority, but in reality they ruled them as colonies. Japan fortified these islands in the 1920s and 1930s. They built naval bases, airfields, and defensive positions. When World War II broke out, these islands became crucial. The same islands Japan took in 1914 became battlegrounds in the 1940s, places like Saipan, Palau, and Truk. American forces had to fight brutal campaigns to retake these islands during the Pacific War. Thousands of American and Japanese soldiers died fighting over islands that had been handed to Japan as spoils of World War I. The Pacific Front also showed Japan that military expansion could bring rewards. They gained territory, resources, and prestige. This mentality contributed to their actions in the 1930s and 1940s. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the war in China starting in 1937, and the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, all of this had roots in the lessons Japan learned during World War I. They learned that aggressive expansion could succeed, especially when other powers were distracted. The forgotten Pacific Front of World War I planted seeds for the massive Pacific War that followed a generation later. The strategic importance of Pacific Islands, the role of naval power, the competition between Japan and Western powers, all of this became clear during World War I and set the stage for World War II. So, here's the key moment we need to understand. World War I wasn't just a European war. It was the first truly global conflict, touching every inhabited continent. The forgotten fronts in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific weren't sideshows. They were integral parts of the war that had massive consequences. These fronts shaped the modern world in ways the Western Front never did. The Western Front was about attrition and holding lines. It was about grinding down the enemy through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The strategic situation on the Western Front in 1918 wasn't that different from 1914. It was still two massive armies facing each other across a line of trenches. Yes, technologies changed, the tactics evolved, and eventually one side won, but the fundamental situation remained the same. But the forgotten fronts were about territory, resources, and redrawing the world map. They were about seizing colonies, capturing oil fields, and dividing up empires. When the war ended, Europe's borders changed, but they mostly reverted to recognizable shapes. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine, the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up, and new nations emerged in Eastern Europe. But these were still nations with historical roots and ethnic identities, even if the borders weren't perfect. But Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific were completely transformed. New countries were created out of nothing. Ancient empires were destroyed, borders were drawn that ignored centuries of history and culture, and the conflicts created by these decisions are still happening today. Think about it. The instability in the Middle East, the conflicts over oil, the tensions between different ethnic and religious groups. So much of this traces back to decisions made during and after World War I. When Britain and France sat down in Paris and drew lines on maps, they weren't thinking about the people who would have to live with those borders for the next 100 years. They were thinking about their own strategic interests, their own resources, their own power. Iraq is a perfect example. The Kurds in the north wanted their own state. They had been promised one by the Allies. But when it came time to actually draw the borders, Britain decided it was more convenient to include Kurdish areas in Iraq because those areas had oil. The Kurds have been fighting for independence or autonomy ever since. Every few decades, the Kurdish question explodes into violence. And it all goes back to British decisions made in 1920. The same thing happened throughout the region. Syria's borders made no sense historically. Lebanon was carved out of Syria to create a Christian majority state, but the borders were drawn to include significant Muslim populations too, which created built-in tensions. Jordan was basically invented as a consolation prize for one of the sons of Hussein bin Ali, who had led the Arab Revolt. These weren't nations with organic identities. They were administrative units created by colonial powers. And Palestine. The situation in Palestine today is directly connected to British decisions during World War I. When Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, they were making a promise about land they didn't even control yet. The Ottoman Empire still ruled Palestine. Britain was making promises about someone else's territory, and they were making contradictory promises to different groups. They promised the Arabs that Palestine would be part of an independent Arab kingdom. They promised the Jews that Palestine would become a Jewish homeland. Both groups believed they had British support. Both groups felt betrayed when they realized the truth. When violence broke out between Arabs and Jews in Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s, the British tried to manage it with various partition plans and white papers and commissions. But nothing worked because the fundamental problem was that Britain had made promises they couldn't keep. They had created a situation where two groups claimed the same land, both believing they had legitimate rights, both feeling betrayed by the power that was supposed to support them. In 1948, when Britain finally gave up and withdrew from Palestine, the conflict exploded into war. That war created the State of Israel and created the Palestinian refugee problem. Subsequent wars in 1956, 1967, and 1973 reshaped the region further. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains one of the most difficult and painful conflicts in the world, and its roots are in World War I decisions made by British officials who never had to live with the consequences. The oil factor cannot be ignored either. When Britain was dividing up the Middle East, oil was just becoming crucial for modern militaries and economies. Britain understood that controlling Middle Eastern oil would give them enormous power. That's why they wanted Iraq and why they drew its borders to include all the oil-rich regions. That's why they maintained control over the Persian Gulf states. That's why they supported certain rulers and opposed others based on whether those rulers would give Britain access to oil. This created a pattern that continues today. Foreign powers intervene in the Middle East to secure oil supplies. They support dictators who give them favorable oil deals. They overthrow governments that threaten their oil interests. The entire modern history of the Middle East is shaped by oil, and the foundation for foreign control of Middle Eastern oil was laid during World War I when Britain and France divided up the Ottoman Empire. The arbitrary borders in Africa that divide ethnic groups and create weak states. Those came from World War I colonial redistribution. When Germany lost its colonies, Britain and France took them over. They didn't give them independence. They didn't ask the people living there what they wanted. They just took them and incorporated them into their own colonial empires. The borders of Cameroon, Togo, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and Namibia were all redrawn after World War I. These borders often split ethnic groups down the middle or forced traditional enemies together. When these countries finally gained independence decades later, they inherited these artificial borders. And changing the borders would have been impossible because every neighboring country had their own ethnic complications. So the borders stayed and the problems persisted. Rwanda is a tragic example. The colonial borders and the colonial system of favoring one ethnic group over another contributed to the tensions that eventually exploded in the 1994 genocide. The seeds of that genocide were planted during the colonial period, which was extended and reinforced by the World War I redistribution of German colonies. Tanzania, formerly German East Africa, became a British colony after the war. The British ruled it differently than the Germans had, but it was still colonial rule. The people who had fought in the war on both sides, the Askari soldiers and carriers who had suffered so much, got nothing. They weren't given independence, they weren't rewarded for their service, they just got new colonial masters. African veterans of World War I returned to their villages to find that nothing had changed except the flag flying over the government buildings. This pattern repeated across Africa. Africans fought and died in a European war, believing they were fighting for freedom, or at least for better treatment under colonial rule. But when the war ended, they were still colonized, and the French used African troops extensively on the Western Front. Thousands of West African soldiers fought and died in France. When they returned home, they expected better treatment, maybe even a path to self-government. Instead, they got the same colonial oppression as before. This created resentment and anger that would fuel independence movements decades later. When Africans finally rose up to demand independence in the 1950s and 1960s, part of their motivation was remembering how their fathers and grandfathers had fought for European powers in World War I and World War II and received nothing in return. The forgotten African front of World War I contributed to the eventual collapse of European colonial empires, though it took another world war and decades of struggle to make it happen. Japan's rise as an aggressive power that led to World War II that started with their easy victories in the Pacific during World War I. Japan entered the war with limited goals. They wanted to secure their position in East Asia and maybe gain some territory. They achieved those goals easily. They took German colonies, they gained influence in China, and they were recognized as a major power at the Paris Peace Conference. But this success created new ambitions. Japanese military leaders and politicians started thinking bigger. If they could take German colonies so easily, why not expand further? If the European powers were weak and distracted, why not take advantage? This thinking led to increasing militarism in Japan through the 1920s and 1930s. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was a direct continuation of the expansion that started in World War I. Japan saw weak China and decided to take what they wanted. The international community protested, but did nothing effective. This taught Japan another lesson. They could act aggressively, and nobody would stop them. The war in China, that started in 1937, was even more brutal. Japanese forces committed terrible atrocities, most notoriously in the rape of Nanking. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed. The violence was extreme and deliberate, and it all connected back to the mentality Japan developed during World War I, that military expansion was acceptable and effective. When World War II broke out in Europe in 1939, Japan saw another opportunity. The European colonial powers were busy fighting in Europe again. Their colonies in Asia were vulnerable. Japan decided to strike south, taking French Indochina, threatening British Malaya and Burma, and eventually attacking the American Philippines and Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War from 1941 to 1945 was one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. Millions died. Entire cities were destroyed. The war ended with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the roots of that war trace back to World War I. The islands Japan captured in 1914 became their forward bases in World War II. The militaristic attitudes developed after easy victories, and World War I grew into the aggressive expansionism of the 1930s and 1940s. The resentment in China over Japanese actions during World War I and its aftermath fed into Chinese resistance during World War II. Everything was connected. The forgotten fronts matter because they show us that World War I wasn't just about trenches and poison gas. It was about imperialism, colonialism, and global power struggles. It was about European powers fighting each other across the entire planet, using soldiers from their colonies as cannon fodder, and then carving up the world based on their own interests without any regard for the people who actually lived there. The soldiers who fought on these forgotten fronts faced conditions just as terrible as those on the Western Front, sometimes worse. They didn't have the same support, the same supplies, or the same recognition. The Askari soldiers marching through the African bush with Leto Vorbeck, the Indian soldiers dying at Kut, the Arab fighters in the desert, the Anzac troops at Gallipoli, they all fought with incredible courage and endured terrible hardships. But their stories are barely told. The carriers in Africa deserve special recognition. Over 1 million men were forced to carry supplies for armies fighting in Africa. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained or armed. They were just men taken from their villages and told to carry heavy loads through impossible terrain. They died in staggering numbers, from disease, exhaustion, starvation, and violence. Some estimates suggest the carrier death rate was higher than the soldier death rate. But there are no memorials to the carriers, no monuments with their names. Their sacrifice is almost completely forgotten. The same is true for the laborers who built the railways, the roads, the camps. The same is true for the people whose crops were seized to feed the armies, whose animals were taken, whose villages were destroyed. The forgotten fronts weren't just forgotten in terms of military history. The civilian suffering was forgotten too. In the Middle East, the Arab revolt is remembered through romanticized stories like Lawrence of Arabia. But the reality was more complex and more painful. The Arabs who fought believed they were fighting for independence. They believed the British promises. When the war ended and they realized they had just traded one imperial master for another, the sense of betrayal was intense. This betrayal poisoned relations between the Arab world and the West for generations. Arab leaders who cooperated with the British and French during the war became seen as traitors or dupes. Arab populations became suspicious of Western intentions. This suspicion was justified by subsequent history. Western powers continued to intervene in the Middle East, overthrow governments, support dictators, and prioritize their own interests over the interests of the people who lived there. Every intervention, every betrayal, every broken promise reinforced the lessons learned from World War I. The modern Middle East is still living with this history. When people in the Middle East look at Western powers with suspicion, when they resist Western intervention, when they talk about imperialism and colonialism, they're not just being difficult. They're remembering history. They're remembering how their great-grandfathers were promised independence and got colonial rule instead. They're remembering how borders were drawn by foreigners. They're remembering how their resources were taken, how their governments were overthrown, how their societies were manipulated. World War I transformed the planet. We know about the trenches, the Western Front, the millions who died in Europe, but if we stop there, we miss half the story. The African campaign showed us brutal guerrilla warfare in impossible conditions and tied up massive resources. The Middle Eastern campaigns dismantled an ancient empire and created the modern Middle East with all its conflicts. The Pacific campaign set the stage for World War II and Japan's rise as a military power. These weren't minor theaters. They were crucial parts of the war that shaped the 20th century and still affect our world today. The borders drawn, the empires destroyed, the power dynamics shifted. All of this came from the forgotten fronts that most people never learn about. The consequences of World War I extend far beyond 1918. The war didn't end when the armistice was signed. The war's effects continued for decades, for generations, for a century. We're still living with decisions made during and after World War I. Every time there's a conflict in the Middle East, every time there's instability in Africa, every time we talk about oil and resources and borders, we're dealing with the legacy of World War I. And the forgotten fronts are key to understanding that legacy. If we only focus on the Western Front, we miss the bigger picture. We don't understand why the world looks the way it does. We don't understand the roots of modern conflicts. We don't understand how imperialism and colonialism shaped the 20th century. The forgotten fronts also remind us that history is more complex than the simple narratives we're taught. There are always more stories, more perspectives, and more consequences than the mainstream version shows us. The soldiers who fought in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific deserve to be remembered just as much as those who fought in France and Belgium. The millions of colonial subjects who were forced to fight in a European war deserve recognition. The civilians who suffered through these campaigns deserve to be remembered. The people whose lands were carved up and redistributed deserve to have their stories told. And the lasting impact of these campaigns on modern geopolitics deserves our attention. World War I didn't just happen in muddy trenches. It happened in jungles, deserts, and tropical islands. It involved people from every corner of the globe, and its consequences reached far beyond 1918. The borders drawn, the empires destroyed, the power dynamics shifted. All of this came from the forgotten fronts that most people never learn about. Understanding these fronts is essential to understanding the modern world. They weren't side stories or footnotes. They were central to the war and central to its legacy. If you want more hidden history stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.